Well, again, Lauren. Okay, so let's see. We were. Okay, before we get into thalamus, hypothalamus, and everything, I want to reinforce the forest instead of getting lost in the trees. Do any of you guys have trouble with that with the brain? Like it's so detailed that you forget the big picture? No? It's because I'm a badass teacher, that's why. So I could not hold the pieces together. I kept forgetting where everything was. So let's go through it one more time. If I'm working on the biggest portion of the brain, right, and the newest portion of the brain, what is that called? Cerebrum. And as I move from the outside to the inside of the cerebrum, the most superficial portion of the cerebrum, the gray matter on the outside, is called what? Cerebral cortex. As I move immediately deep to that, what am I going to run into? White matter of the brain, yeah. And I don't make you memorize all the tracks, but there's 3 different kinds, and we'll reinforce that as we go through today, right? Okay. And then as I move immediately medial to the white matter, as I'm moving toward the core, I'm going to run into more paired masses of gray matter. What are those called? Cerebral nuclei, right? Those cerebral nuclei. And then as I go even more medial than the cerebral nuclei, what I'm going to run into, so here are my cerebral nuclei right here. It's just sort of medial to the insula, right? Do you see them? And then I'm going to run into more paired masses of gray matter. Those paired masses of gray matter are part of the diencephalon, yeah? And the diencephalon includes everything with the word thalamus in it, which is what? Epi, hypo, and thalamus, yeah? Okay, so since we did this last time, now that's not usually how you would be asked to identify the thalamus and the hypothalamus, but really it gives you spatial orientation with the other structures that we've been doing. So the way that you would generally identify the diencephalon is with a mid-sagittal section, right? But it's kind of giving you a false impression of what the diencephalon actually looks like, because it's not just this. So this region right here, the meaty portion that surrounds the third ventricle, that's the thalamus from a mid-sagittal section. Somebody give me a short version of what the thalamus does. Anybody remember? Yeah, something about that? It's the router or relay station for sensory information to the cerebral cortex, right? Good? Okay. Somebody tell me a very simplified version of what the hypothalamus does. But use a phys word. Homeostasis. There you go. Okay. By the way, if you just remember homeostasis, you're probably going to get a C on the brain portion. If you want to get a B, you remember more than just the word that was in all caps, right? You put a little bit more detail. And if you want to get an A, you probably remember as much of it as you possibly can, right? Okay. But I know that there's so much detail to all of this that you need something portable to take with you, right? You're like, oh, homeostasis, I got it. And then what is it that you remember about the epithalamus and the pineal gland? Melatonin, yeah, melatonin, right? Good. Okay, so now what we are going to do is we are going to move lower, and we're also moving older, yeah? We're getting to older functionality. So again, big picture understanding, the most complex functionality, the most intellect, the most personality was on the outside, and then we start moving in and we have rage and sex drive and controlling motor activity, right? And now we're moving even further in and we're controlling homeostasis, right? Right? Does that make sense? And sleep-wake cycles and that kind of stuff. And now we're moving even further down, and we're going to start, for instance, controlling reflexes, right? Later on, we're going to control our heart rate, our blood pressure, and our respiration. So do you see how all of these functions, as you move back evolutionarily, you would have that in common with the fish, right? Okay? As you move up, both anatomically and evolutionarily, the more unique things are uniquely mammalian, right? Some of them perhaps even uniquely human. I don't know. We don't have any way to tell, really. Okay, so now where we are going is right here. Do you see? Okay, we are in the brainstem now. Everything below the diencephalon that is not cerebellum is brainstem. Okay, so everything from here down. And again, you just find the thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus, and that's the diencephalon. Everything below there. This top portion of the brain stem is called the mesencephalon. Okay? That is the reason that I told you a while ago that I think this aqueduct is more correctly named the mesencephalic aqueduct. Because it ain't in the cerebrum, is it? Is that in the cerebrum? No, it's not at all. So you can call it the cerebral aqueduct if you want, but the mesencephalic aqueduct, the aqueduct runs through the mesencephalon. Do you see that aqueduct? Yeah. And I'm not going to make you change the name, although FYI, they are changing it in most of the anatomy textbooks. Go ahead.
Instead of mesencephalon or whatever, can you say midbrain?
You can, but I'm going to use mesencephalon, so you have to be familiar with it, even if you don't want to write it out. Okay. This guy right here is the mesencephalon, but it's more than that, so let's look at what it actually is. And there's some terminology confusion with the mesencephalon that hopefully I will be able to clarify for you. Okay, so what are you actually looking at when you look at that? So I want to orient you with this picture, okay? It's a weird-ass looking picture. What it is the brain with the cerebrum and the cerebellum taken off. Everything else is still there, including the thalamus, the paired masses, right? Egg-shaped masses of nuclei. The hypothalamus right here with the mammillary bodies on it, right? That's still there. And then the regions right around the hypothalamus, those are going to be part of the mesencephalon. So let's find them. Do you see this right here, the two little booties on the back, right? Orient yourself because that's the pineal gland, right? Okay, so thalamus and epithalamus and pineal gland, right? Okay, so now let's find what we're actually looking for as far as the mesencephalon, okay? What we're looking for as the mesencephalon. The mesencephalon has white matter and gray matter. Don't be at all surprised that as we move down to the brainstem, there's always going to be white matter tracts involved because the brainstem is going to do a whole lot of transmitting information to and from, right? Sometimes even left to right. So there's always going to be white matter that you're going to be dealing with down here. So as you get into the mesencephalon, you've got gray matter and you've got white matter. Let's talk about the gray matter first. Ready? So these two things right here, two pairs, these are called the superior colliculi on top and the inferior colliculi on the bottom. Collectively, this is wrong, but people very often call them the tectal plate. I will tell you why it's wrong. I will take it as an answer, but I am going to talk to the textbook author when I see her in May and let her know that that's confusing the hell out of everybody. Okay, so collectively, a better name for them is the corpora quadrigemina, and that's a lot of syllables, but if you break it down, it's okay. Corpora means body, quadra means four, gemina means twins. So the four twin body, right? So collectively, those are called the corpora quadrigemina. Let me just show you why it's not actually the tectal plate. So if you look at it from here, this is where one half of that top butt and the other half of the and one half of the bottom butt are, right? So that's like the right portion of the top and of the superior and inferior colliculi. Okay, what the tectal plate is, guys, is the thing that they sit on because it's a plate. Okay, and I won't nitpick you about it, but I don't use the word tectal plate. And I'm taking it out of the lab manual when I revise it next time. I'm taking it out of my lecture notes too. So a plate is generally flat. And by the way, I'm doing a little bit of literature search on it right now, but I think, not that you care, I think the tectal plate is actually white matter and the corpora quadrigemina are gray matter nuclei. So, okay, but regardless, when you look back at this picture, so where would you, if you were looking at a sheep brain, and you did last week, did you guys get to dissect the sheep brains? They were pretty damn good ones. We bought the more expensive ones with the dura mater intact this time, so you got to see lots of cranial nerves, and they looked a lot better. Did you find the superior and inferior colliculi? How'd you find it? Yeah, you pull the cerebellum away from the cerebrum, and you look up there, and it looks like you got a little booty up there, doesn't it? Got a little baby butt, right? And a little roll of fat underneath it, simply because the superior colliculi are primarily visual reflexes, and the inferior colliculi are auditory reflexes, and sheep don't hear very well, but they see pretty well. So their visual and auditory reflexes are not the same. In a human, they're about the same size. The gray matter in them is about the same size, so it doesn't look quite the same when you look at a human brain. So These, we're getting to older functionality. We're talking about visual and auditory reflexes, not conscious visual and auditory responses. So if you say something to me and you say, can I have drink your water bottle, and I hand it to you, that's obviously involving me looking at it, right? And figuring out that that's what you're asking for and handing it to you. It's also involving language. So that would be like visual processing, conscious visual processing. But if something comes at my face, right, I will have a visual reflex before I even realize it's there. So reflexes are dumb, but they're fast. And they're life-sustaining, right? We're getting to older functionality here. Same thing with auditory reflex. If you ask me a question, I have to process it. That's an intellectual auditory response using my cerebral cortex, right? But if a big boom happens and I move away from it, that's an auditory reflex. That's dumb and fast, right? So we're dumber, faster stuff while all the way down here. Everybody okay? Okay, so that's what those four do, the superior and inferior colliculi, which are collectively called the corpora quadrigemina. Now, what about the rest of the mesencephalon? The rest of the mesencephalon are these guys right here. Do you see? Just below the thalamus and just above the pons are these. They're white matter tracts, and they kind of look like they would be tracts, right? Because you kind of see the implication that you've got a whole bunch of parallel things running up there. What kind of tracts do you think they probably are? Three choices: projection, commissural, or association. Yeah, they're projection tracts. They're primarily projection tracts that's carrying information to and from older, newer portions of the brain, right? And also spinal cord, right? So that's primarily what those are. These are called the cerebral peduncles. They're easy to find because they are just lateral to the mammillary bodies. Although just so you know, this picture doesn't show it, but the cerebral peduncles are here, and the mammillary bodies are in a different plane. They're like pushed back. So the hypothalamus is a little further up, right? So those are your cerebral peduncles, and they're primarily white matter tracts carrying information up and down. And you can't see them on a mid-sagittal section because they're lateral. Yeah? To me, they're always easy to find because they look like the push-up bra around the mammillary bodies, right? You got to smash them together and put them up. That's how push-up bras work, right? So that is the cerebral peduncles. Everybody okay with that? So what the mesencephalon includes is primarily the superior and inferior colliculi and the cerebral peduncles. But then let's go back and reinforce just one more time that the aqueduct runs through the mesencephalon. Hence, Melanie wants it to be called the mesencephalic aqueduct, and it is in most textbooks. Okay. All right. So, also, by the way, as you start to get down here to this level, you're going to find more cranial nerves attached to the brainstem than anywhere else. The vast majority of them are attached to the brainstem. We will start going through the cranial nerves at the end here. We'll talk about them. Okay, everybody okay? Mesencephalon or midbrain? All right, so now we're going to keep moving down the brainstem. And as we keep moving down the brainstem, the next place we're going to go is the pons. And if I have you on a test write the word pons, it's because I'm nice. I could have had you write corpora quadrigemina. So don't spell pons wrong. Don't put a D in there. It's P-O-N-S, okay? So it's pon, and people do it all the time, P-O-N-D-S. I'm like, I gave you the easiest damn word in the whole brain. Spell it right. As a matter of fact, I'm going to tell you right now, if you spell pons wrong, I'm counting the whole damn thing wrong. I'm not even going to, right? Because I could have asked you mesencephalic aqueduct. Okay, so here's the pons. The pons has a little depression down the middle of it, and there's going to be a blood vessel that you'll learn that runs up there. You'll learn the blood vessels a little later. So let's look at what the pons does. We're moving toward older functionality. The pons is gray matter and white matter, not surprisingly. And if you look at this picture, so I wouldn't test you off this picture. I just want you to orient so that you can actually see what's going on with the pons. The pons has nuclei, gray matter nuclei within it. Most of the function that you're concerned with about the pons is respiration. It helps to control breathing. Is that okay? It also controls urination, but breathing, urination. So we're really old functionality now, right? We're not writing any poetry at all down here. So it's got like the respiratory center. They call it the pontine respiratory center. Not surprisingly, because we're starting to control vital physiological processes. When you get into physiology, you end up coming back, talking about how the pons controls this and how the medulla oblongata controls that, because these are vital physiological functions. All right, so primarily its big picture thing that you need to understand is that the pons is really getting involved in controlling breathing, okay? But it also has white matter, and you can see that the white matter, actually, they're going two different directions. See that one? That one's probably a projection tract carrying information to and from lower portions of the brain, spinal cord, right, up and back, okay? And then this one right here, that's a commissural tract, because how one half of the cerebellum communicates with the other half is it sends fibers across the pons, okay? So it's got both in it, right? And you don't have to be able to identify them. I'm just trying to tell you what the whole thing does, right? You don't have to say that's a commissural tract and that's a projection tract, but you can see by looking at it, it's actually pretty easy to see if you have a good fresh brain. Like you can actually see the direction the white matter fibers are going, which is pretty damn cool. Okay, so, but I would never ask you this picture because that's just trying to torture people. What the hell's that all about? I think that what they're just trying to show you is that there's white matter in it and there's gray matter in it, but that's a bastard picture. We won't use that one. Okay, so, more cranial nerves attached there, and then now we are going to move down to the medulla oblongata. And as we move down to the medulla oblongata, as we move down to the medulla oblongata, now here we are. Okay, again, I would not ask you to identify it from this picture, but this just shows you some of the functionality of the medulla oblongata, because all of these are nuclei, right? They're all different color. They're not actually different colors, but they colored them different colors, right? And they kind of tell you what the medulla oblongata does. It helps with respiration. It helps the pons with respiration. And it also has, look, cardiac and vasomotor centers. So what's really going on in the medulla oblongata is primarily controlling your breathing, your heart rate, and your blood pressure, right? So now we are all the way down to really, really life-sustaining functionality. Good? That's what your medulla oblongata does. So this picture is not easy to identify. So how you would be asked medulla oblongata is either on a mid-sagittal brain, everything below the pons and above the foramen magnum is considered medulla oblongata, right? Or you could be asked on like an intact brain, even though this is showing you the cranial nerves. It's not hard for you to know that that's a medulla oblongata, right? Okay. So it's easy, right? It's easy to find. FYI, the medulla oblongata, the bottom part of it and the top part of the spinal cord are indistinguishable from one another because it's really just continuous. It's pretty arbitrary that we call it medulla oblongata above the foramen magnum and spinal cord below because it's indistinguishable from each other. It's just like, oh, that's a landmark, and now we're going to say, right? And it's still CNS tissue as it goes through the foramen magnum, right? Okay, so that's medulla oblongata. And breathing, heart rate, blood pressure. Not surprisingly, the medulla oblongata, if you were going to look at it, has gray matter nuclei, right? It's also got white matter tracts. What kind of tracts do you think are most common in the medulla oblongata? Projection. And remember the one, I hate this picture, and I won't ask you this picture. The one thing I like about it is that it shows you that that's where the crossover occurs, right? Remember that when we were folding the brain, right? The central nervous system tissue, however the hell long ago it happened in evolution, what happened is tracts that were projection tracts got folded over, and anything that goes through here, which is called the decussation of pyramids, how those white matter tracts fold over one another and cross in the medulla oblongata, anything that goes through this is going to be controlling or sensing the opposite side of the body, right? And I don't know when this occurred. I'm going to have to do a little reading about it. I'm kind of interested in it. Everybody okay with that? Okay, so that occurs in the white matter of the medulla oblongata. Everybody all right? Okay, all right, so let's do one more time. Okay, I want you guys to try, if you can, to give me one-word functionality as we go through parts of the brain. Ready? One-word functionality that tells me you can put together structure with function, or at least one phrase. It can be more than a word, not a paragraph. Medulla oblongata. Blood pressure, heart rate, respiration. Pons. Respiration, exactly. Let me finish saying it. Mesencephalon, including superior and inferior colliculi. Auditory and visual reflexes. Okay, now it's going to get a little harder because we haven't done this recently. Diencephalon, separated into three parts. Hypothalamus. What does the hypothalamus do? Homeostasis. What does the thalamus do? Communicates what kind of information, Stephanie? She said it last time. Didn't you say it last time? I thought you said it last time. What kind of information? Sensory information to the cerebral cortex, right? Okay. And then epithalamus. Melatonin. Good. All right. And then we are going to go up. You ready? This is where people get uncomfortable. How about cerebral nuclei? They do several different things. Come up with some. Cerebral nuclei. I'll wait for you. You can do this. Amygdala is one of them. What's that one do? Fear, rage, territoriality. What? Emotion, all that kind of stuff. Addictions in there. Also, control of voluntary motor activity has to go through those things. Okay? What? Only that amygdala is just one little portion of the cerebral nuclei. There's a whole bunch of them. Yeah? Okay, and now we're almost done torturing you. Moving just lateral to the cerebral nuclei, we're going to run into the white matter. Does anybody want to give a shot as to what the white matter does within the brain? Yeah, it's just wiring to and from different places. And then last but not least, the newest portion is the cerebral cortex. What does it do? Yeah, consciousness, intellect, all of the conscious processing. Got it? Okay, now you know more about the brain than almost everybody you're ever going to meet. It's true. It's really hard to grasp it, and people can't come up with it. So, all right. So we just have to do cerebellum and cranial nerves, and then we'll move on to spinal cord. Okay, cerebellum is actually interesting. The cerebellum, even though it's way down here, it's actually not old functionality. It develops kind of parallel to the cerebrum. It's not intellect, though. It's got this sort of parallel functionality because primarily what it's doing is controlling, not really controlling, it's smoothing and coordinating your motor activity. And we know where it is, right? It's just behind the fourth ventricle, right? That's the fourth ventricle. And it's just behind the brain stem, right? And just like inferior to the cerebrum is where it's going to be. So let's just look at its basic anatomy and then we will start talking about its functionality. It would be in an intact brain separated by a fissure. We don't have very many fissures. We've got the longitudinal fissure and then we've got a transverse fissure right here. And in that fissure, if this brain were intact and living, there would be a chunca dura mater. Who remembers what that's called? Tentorium cerebelli, down there, okay? And if you do a section of the cerebellum, it has a really distinct gray matter, white matter arrangement, right? Gray matter on the outside, white matter on the inside. The white matter on the inside looks like a tree, yeah? You don't even have to like squint to make it look like a tree. It looks like a tree. And it's called the arbor vitae, which means tree of life, because they used to think that the cerebellum was necessary for life-sustaining processes, and they were wrong. It's not. And then if you look at just the posterior view of the cerebellum, you'll see it's got two hemispheres, right and left cerebral hemispheres. And then it's got this wormy looking thing in the middle. That's called the vermis, which means vermin, like worm. Okay. And then the folds of the cerebellum are different than the cerebrum. Cerebrum has gyri and sulci, right? This has what we call folia, which means leaves, because somebody thought it looked like an evergreen tree. Okay. So that's what it's called, folia on the outside. So now let's talk about the function of the cerebellum, because it's actually kind of interesting. The cerebellum is actually responsible for posture and equilibrium. I mean, it works with your cranial nerves in your ears, but that's where it actually goes on. It also is controlled with what we call muscle memory. It doesn't happen in your muscles because your muscles don't do anything, right? They're just like response tissue. They don't have a memory of anything. So what we call muscle memory actually happens in the cerebellum primarily. And it's also responsible for coordinating and smoothing and speeding your body movements. And I know that you have dealt with your cerebellum before. So let me tell you a couple of different things that allow you to understand what the cerebellum does. First semester that I think it was the first semester that I taught when I was teaching in Texas, I had a student, and she was like tiny. She was like 4'11", and she had been a cheerleader in high school. And because she was tiny, she's always on top of the pyramid, right? She fell off the pyramid one too damn many times, right? And she actually damaged her cerebellum. And I knew her a year, maybe 2 years after that, and she was still trying to regain some functionality. How did that manifest? Well, when we talked about the brain in lab, she said, hey, can I talk to you? And I was like, sure. Can you walk with me in my office? And she's like, nope, sure can't. I'll meet you there. And why? Because what your cerebellum does is it is your muscle memory that allows you to do activities you have done many times before without engaging your cerebral cortex to do them. So when a baby is learning to walk, you can see that it's like a lot of processing with their cerebral cortex, right? They're trying to learn to walk. Or when you try to learn a bike, or to ride a bike, it's hard. There's a lot of crap going on with riding a bike. So it's all cerebral cortex activity until you know it. And then what happens is you can pass it off to your cerebellum to free up this thinking space to have an anxiety attack or whatever the hell you're going to do while you're walking, right? So she couldn't do that. She couldn't pass off patterns of motor activity to her cerebellum. And so she couldn't walk and talk at the same time with me. Because what happened, and this is how she described it to me, she's like, it's not like the words go on in my head, but I'm pretty much like thinking right foot, left foot, right foot, left foot, right? And she has to completely engage her cerebrum with that process, right? And it had gotten better because when it first happened, she had lost posture and equilibrium. So every time she stood up, she felt like she was off balance and she constantly had to like stabilize herself. So it's muscle memory. Now, for those of you who play music or do anything athletic or dancers, right? When you are teaching yourself something brand new, a motor activity, you have to engage your cerebrum. You've never done it before. It's not going to be very smooth. It's not going to be very fast. You are in the process of getting good at it, which means you have to suck at it first, right? That's what I'm always trying to tell my 12-year-old. I'm like, he's like, how do you get good at something? I'm like, be willing to suck at it for a long time, right? You just have to, right? And then eventually you've done it so many times that you can actually pass it off from your cerebrum to your cerebellum, which is faster and smoother at it. Yes? And unfortunately, we've all had the experience that if you pass it off from your cerebrum to your cerebellum, let's say you're a baseball pitcher, and you've done this pitch 150 times, 250 times, whatever, during practice, then you're in a game. Do you need to think about the process of doing the pitch while you're actually in the game? Is it going to help you to do that? No, it is not going to help you at all because this is smoother and this is faster, right? So what you need to do is you need to get out of your head, right? You need to just basically depend on your cerebrum to initiate it and your cerebellum to take over, right? If you start thinking about it too much, you're going to jack it up because your cerebrum can pretty much jack up anything. So we experience that all the time. Sometimes our cerebellum is taken over when we probably shouldn't let it. Like if you are really, really busy-minded, which I always am, it's just my inherent state of being, and you are driving your car on a route that you have driven hundreds of times before. Have you ever gotten where you're going and have no recollection that it occurred and you were stone cold sober? You're like, I don't even know how the hell I got here. What happened, right? What that is your cerebrum initiates it, and your cerebellum takes it over. Because it's so familiar, your cerebellum really knows the pattern. All that happens is when there's a new stimulus, you will engage your cerebrum for just a second, like a red light. Engage your cerebrum for just a second, right? Keep it on as long as the pattern has been changed. And then as soon as the pattern goes back to its initial state, you go right back into your cerebellum activity. So you don't even remember the red light. It just like went in just enough, right? It's not good for us to drive that way, FYI. It's better for us to drive with our cerebrum engaged. But that doesn't actually happen if you're driving a new route, does it? No, if you're driving a new route, it's all cerebrum, it's not cerebellum. So it's kind of interesting. So this is what your cerebellum does for you. It has your muscle memory. It maintains your posture and equilibrium. There is some decent initial research that says that people who are fantastic at coordination, athleticism, have a little bit more gray matter in their cerebellum than the rest of us. So I'm pretty sure mine's just like that big because I have no coordination whatsoever, right? Constantly tripping over my own feet. Okay, so the fourth ventricle is located anterior to the cerebellum. So that's your cerebellum. Okay, cranial nerves. Let's talk about what you need to know about cranial nerves. Same stuff you need to know in lab, you need to know in lecture. But I want to give you some organization, how to remember these. There's 12 pairs of them, so you know you're going to have to learn them on your own, right? If there's more than 3 of anything, I can't teach it to you in front of class, right? Because you know you're just like, I just keep talking, it doesn't make any difference. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They are specifically attached to the brain. Depending on which lab instructor you have, you could either be asked them off of a model or off of an actual wet specimen. If you have Jill, I will tell you flat out, she ain't going to ask them off a model. She doesn't use models unless she absolutely has to. She always asks off of specimens and never non-human specimens. So, but some of you guys will get asked off a model. The only thing I want to caution you about asking off a model is when you get the model, make sure that these bottom nerves that you're looking at are not cervical spinal nerves because some of the models have a few of the spinal nerves on them. And if you start from that side and go up, you're going to get them wrong. So start from number 1 and go down, right? And then you can do process of elimination. Now, obviously it's pretty easy up here, right? Not a whole hell of a lot going on. It's down here that it gets pretty hairy and you need a little practice with it. So with the cranial nerves, first off, they are all attached directly to the brain, but they're nervous tissue. They're nerves, not tracts, meaning that they're myelinated in a different way. Mostly they do head stuff, right? Cranial nerves mostly do head stuff, with one big exception, which is cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. Roman numerals 1 through 12. If you don't know about Roman numerals, it's understandable because they're pretty archaic, but you do need to learn 12 of them. Okay, there's no way around it because that is how they are numbered just kind of universally. So you got to learn Roman numerals 1 through 12 and you have to be able to both write them and identify them 1 through 12, and that's not terrible. And then they all have individual names, and their names are not consistently named. I mean, they're not always named for what they do. Sometimes they're named for a hole they go through. Sometimes they're named for like their general structure, like trigeminal, which is like 3 twins. And then sometimes they're named for what they actually do. So you've got your optic nerves and your olfactory nerves and things. Those are easy, okay? So what else do you have to know? You have to know their numbers. You have to know their names. There's a whole bunch of mnemonics to remember the names. Believe it or not, the dirtier ones work better. And that is not just me generally being the irreverent and inappropriate person that I am. There's also decent empirical data that says that if you are slightly shocked or slightly titillated, it increases synaptic activity in your brain. So you think I'm just inappropriate to bother you, so you can write terrible things about me on my evaluations. But no, I am inappropriate because it makes me a good teacher. Yes, that's also why I don't teach high school, because I can't get away with it. At least here in California, I probably could, right? Yeah, if I was teaching in San Francisco, I could get away with anything. Okay, so numbers, names, holes they go through. All of those freaking holes that you learned in the skull now are relevant, right? If one of your lab instructors decides to tell you you don't have to know the holes, I will find out and I will add the holes back, okay? Because it was arbitrary for me to make you learn those holes if you never ever refer to them again, right? So, and sometimes the hole like tells you what you need to know. I wonder where the hypoglossal nerve goes through. I can't even fathom where that would go through. Can you? Go ahead.
So it's not enough to know like it's sphenoid or ethmoid. You want more like specific. Like,
I want the hole. The hole of the bone. Yes. It's the same thing that's on your lab list, right? Right. It's exactly what's required on that column of your lab list. I wrote it, so I know what's on there. Okay. So yes, you do have to know that. And the thing is not to torture you. The thing is that all of this stuff is one whole story, right? It's one whole story, and if you link it, you are more likely to retain it. Yes? If you put portions of the story, it's going to stick with you longer. It's going to help you in your particular clinical activities. Okay, so name, number, whole, and then function. And the function has two things to it. Is it sensory, motor, or both? And then be more specific about what it senses, what motor activity it has. Does that make sense? Okay. So with these, it's just going to take a little practice. It's actually not as hard as it initially seems. It sure as hell isn't as hard as learning muscles. And there's only 12 of them, and you can do them. Okay. So these are the cranial nerves. They're going to take a little while. Try to figure out, especially the ones that are really confusing, try to figure out a way that you can find the difference between 9, 10, and 11. Those are pretty difficult, or 9, 10, and 12. Okay, so as far as functionality, this ends up being clinically important, by the way, because if someone has an injury or a damage, then a lot of times I can do an initial assessment to see if a certain cranial nerve was damaged. And that's one of the first things they teach in one of the first semesters of nursing school, is to know how to do a cranial nerve assessment. And so I'll show you guys this video, which is just adorable. This is from Texas, the Texas Women's University, which is right next to where I went to grad school. And these adorable little people. He can't sing, but I can't either, and I wasn't brave enough to make this, okay? I keep trying to get my lab aides to make songs, because the lab aides, so I teach a lab aid class, and the lab aides are responsible for doing a project every semester, and the project either has to deepen their knowledge or help future students, which is why we've got so many resources for anatomy, right? All of those resources up there, most of them are made by the lab aides. And I keep wanting them to, like, will you just make some music? I know some of you people have musical talent. Why the hell aren't you hooking me up? Because I ain't got none. Okay, ready? This is just adorable. I think. Okay.
Greener one gave me a whiff. What's that? Is that C-diff? Sensory nerve guides my sniffs. Olfactory is the way. Second nerve helps me see right. Central peripheral side. Sensory nerve for my eyes. Optic nerve is the way. Pupils constricting. Third nerve, eyes moving. Prevent silent drooping. I can more than nerve, baby. The trochlear nerve works the superior oblique. This is the fourth nerve, hard to look down if it's weak. Trigeminal nerve works mastication. It's sensory and motor, deals with face sensation. Abduces its sixth, does eye abduction. Motor nerve for motion, helps prevent double vision. Facial is seven, does facial expression. It's sensory and motor, 2/3 of taste sensation. Vestibulocochlear, eighth nerve body balancer, used for the ear sound sensor. It's sensory and hair. Glossopharyngeal nerve, senses taste from the 1/3. Back of the tongue, the ninth nerve. It helps us swallow hay. 10th nerve is vacant. Let's us speak and say stuff. Custard only if dysphagia. It's sensory and motor, baby. Accessory nerve is the 11th. So shrug your shoulders, maintains head resistance. The hypoglossal nerve is the 12th nerve. Deals with the movement, mnemonic, let's get to it. Old Olympus top, offending German, Beats and pops, hey. Some say marry money, but my brother says it brings back more.
I want to memorize this next part, but I can't do it. Not yet. But I got 12. You have 12?
Olympus top, offending German, Beats and pop, hey. Some say marry money, but my brother says it brings back more. Hey.
Why won't they make me any more songs? I have a whole group of people who's supposed to be doing this for me. So he goes through sensory, motor, or both, right? You guys remember that from last time. And then he goes through some specific functionality. Those are the specific clinically important functionalities that you're probably going to learn if you go to nursing school, for instance. But I also wanted to show you one more little way of, I want to get good at drawing this, but I'm not. So this figure, I love this. It's so much information in this figure. Have you guys seen one of these before? So if somebody sends me an email, I'll post it for you and you guys can learn to draw it. So what it has is all of the nerves by number in the location or the function that they have. So what's cranial nerve number 1 do? Olfactory. 2? Vision. 3 is oculomotor, which controls the function of the eye. How about number 4? Number 4 is the trochlear nerve, which helps with, among other things, mastication. It also does some sensory function of this region right here. So here's 4. What's 5? 5 is the trigeminal nerve, and it does some mouth stuff that we're talking, mastication with mouth stuff, right? And number 6 does part of the tongue. Number 12 does the rest of the tongue, right? Do you see that? Number 7, what does number 7 do? That's a facial nerve, most of the facial muscles, right? I like this one even better because 7's like this. It's like almost the whole face. What does 8 do? Yeah, it's the vestibulocochlear, which is hearing, right? How about 9? Back portion of the tongue, right? 10. 12 is sticking out your tongue. What does 11 do? Right? So I think this is fantastic. If I could just like draw it fast enough. I've drawn it before, but it takes me like 15 minutes of class time. So I don't know why the hell I didn't come in early and do it, but I didn't. So I think this is really helpful. Or there's a whole bunch of different iterations of this, but I like this one. Okay, so that's the cranial nerve. And so in lecture, you're going to be responsible for the same thing that you are in lab. Pretty much, and I simplified the functionality of the cranial nerve in that lab, cranial nerves in that lab table. They are more complicated than that. There's a lot more functionality in your textbook, but if you know the detail that's in your lab manual, you'll be fine. That's the kind of detail I expect you to learn. Cool? Okay, everybody good? All right, so with our last bit of time, we are going to start on the spinal cord, which is what you guys are doing in lab this week. Okay. Okay, so you guys are doing three things in lab this week. You're doing spinal cord, spinal nerves, and you're doing eye and ear. I don't do eye and ear in lecture. Something had to go. Instead, I do autonomic nervous system anatomy because I know that you need that for physiology. So I have to go back and revisit autonomic nervous system anatomy and like figure out how you wire it up to your heart so that you can increase or decrease your heart rate, which ends up being important for phys. So I don't test on eye and ear in lecture either. Okay, you're just tested on it in lab. All right, so this is chapter 18, so chapter 16, and a little bit of chapter 18. I don't test on it as much detail as chapter 18 has. So let's just start with the spinal cord overview. The spinal cord does really kind of two different things. First off, it's a lot of sending information to and from the brain to the peripheral nervous system to the brain. So, of course, it's going to have a whole bunch of white matter in it. What do you guys think that most of the white matter tracts in the spinal cord are? Yeah, most of them are projection tracts. There are a few commissural that go left to right, but mostly projection tracts, right? And then in addition, the spinal cord also does some really simple integration. But remember, we're really old functionality now, so we're not going to be writing any poetry. We're not going to be making any conscious decisions. But we can do hand on a hot stove, move your damn hand. That can happen at the spinal cord level, right? So it's just really, really simple integration that can happen at the spinal cord level. Anything that happens at the spinal cord level, you have no awareness that it occurred. You have no conscious or voluntary control of it. Okay. If you become aware of it, it's after the fact. Like for instance, if I put my hand on a hot stove and it goes in and I move my hand, the decision was made before I told my cerebral cortex. So why did I tell my cerebral cortex? Well, it's like teenagers do. You're asking forgiveness, not permission, right? You're like, I already did it. Hope it was cool, right? And your cerebral cortex wants to remember for the next time because it needs to think, oh, that thing's very likely to be hot. Don't do that again, dummy, right? So you tell your cerebral cortex, but it happens after the fact, like after the thing has already been initiated. Okay, so it is hollow. It has a hole in the middle. It's not got a big hole, but it has a hole in the middle called the central canal, and the central canal has cerebrospinal fluid in it, right? Okay. It begins right below the foramen magnum, and it ends way higher than people expect it to. So right below the foramen magnum is when your spinal cord starts, and we would assume, pretty reasonably, that because your spinal cord goes all the way down to the fused sacrum, right, or because your vertebrae go all the way down to the fused sacrum, you would assume that your spinal cord does as well, but it doesn't. Your spinal cord ends, so your last two ribs right here, two vertebrae below there, right about there is where your spinal cord ends. What runs in the vertebral canal after that is PNS tissue, not CNS tissue. Does that make sense? There's still nervous tissue in there, but it's not CNS tissue, okay? So your spinal cord usually averages about 16 to 18 inches long, but that's just based on body size. Like he's way taller than me. His doesn't end way up here. It still goes to L2, right? So it just goes to about L1 or L2, depending whatever your body size is. So if we could have Shaquille O'Neal donate his body out to science, he'd have a hell of a long spinal cord, right? Big everything. Man, I would love to dissect him. That'd be fantastic. I'm gonna ask him. You think that would be the weirdest thing he's ever been asked? Probably. Okay, so L1 or L2 is where your spinal cord proper ends. Have any of you guys already been to lab this week? No? Okay. The spinal cord is so damn tiny. Like, it was shocking to me how little it actually was because it's pretty freaking important. It's only about 1/2 inch in diameter, and it's even thinner than that. So it's so little. It's not just little in those people because they were old. It's just little. It's a teeny tiny little structure, about 1/2 inch in diameter. And it's composed of primarily gray matter on the inside and white matter on the outside. So it's different than the brain. Swapped. I have no idea why. Okay. And then, but after the spinal cord ends, the meninges don't end. So look at this figure. This sac that you're seeing around the outside, that is actually the meninges, primarily the dura mater and the arachnoid. The pia mater stays stuck to the spinal cord, by the way. And so the spinal cord ends right about here, okay? But the meninges go down to about S2, which is why, again, when we talked about having either an epidural injection or a lumbar puncture, why do they, if you have an epidural injection, why do they not do it between T8 and T9?
So they could poke the actual...
Yeah, you don't want to damage CNS tissue. I mean, you don't want to damage anything, right? But if you did damage something, you sure as hell don't want to damage CNS tissue, right? So we're going to go between L1 and L2 or L3 and L4, depending on how far down you want to anesthetize. Same thing for a lumbar puncture. In theory, we could get cerebrospinal fluid from up here. That would be too damn risky. So what they do is they poke through. In order to get cerebrospinal fluid out for a lumbar puncture or spinal tap, which meninges do you have to puncture? Dura, and then into the arachnoid and subarachnoid space, right? That makes sense? And then you suck it out and you examine it for content of the cerebrospinal fluid, chemical content, pathogens, white blood cells, all that kind of stuff. So it extends way, way down here. Okay. The only one that is kind of different is the dura and the arachnoid go all the way down. The pia just stays stuck to one of these little teeny structures, and I'll talk about it in just a second. So the pia is stuck on the surface of the spinal cord, and then it stays stuck to one of those structures. Only one, though. Okay, so there are, again, 12 pairs of cranial nerves, right? And those are the nerves that are directly attached to the brain. And there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and those are the ones that are directly attached to the spinal cord. Yeah? Okay, here's a difference between cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Cranial nerves can be sensory, motor, or both. Yes? All of the spinal nerves, all 31 pairs, are both. They're all mixed in function, okay? They're all sensory and motor, all of them, okay? And they don't have individual names. They're numbered and given a letter for where they come out of the vertebral column. So these are cervical spinal nerves, and I'll talk about the numbering in a minute. The T ones are thoracic spinal nerves, right? The L ones are lumbar spinal nerves, and the S ones are sacral spinal nerves, and you got one little lonely coccygeal spinal nerve, okay? I'll teach you the numbering at some point, okay? So those are your spinal nerves. Now, just big picture understanding of what they do, just look at them really quickly. And this is kind of what you guys are going to do in lab. You can go into outrageous amounts of anatomical detail about like how these things come out and where they go. We've simplified it quite a bit for you guys. So if you end up taking advanced anatomy, you'll figure out that we like took out a whole bunch of the detail. But here's the deal. So they come off in different regions, and they form little wads of nerves called plexuses. Okay, you with me? So do you see this collection of nerves right there? That's called the sacral plexus. Everybody okay? Now, I'm going to oversimplify, but you guys are doing this in lab this week, so at least you'll have some preparation. The oversimplification of what the sacral plexus does is a little bit of the back of the thigh and almost the whole leg and foot, right? Sensory and motor function of what that does. And then it has a little one that goes to your junk. Whoop, right? The one comes off there and goes to your junk. Good? Okay. The lumbar plexus mostly does the anterior thigh and whatever you didn't take care of with the sacral plexus. So you see we're moving up the body as we move up the spinal cord. What do the thoracic spinal nerves do? Well, they do mostly sensory and motor function for the thorax and the abdomen. Okay? And then we're going to move up even further. This one right here coming from the bottom of the cervical spinal nerves, these guys right here, it's going to the arm, and it's going to do sensory and motor function of the upper limbs. Good? And then this guy right here is mostly neck muscles. Any neck muscle that you didn't take care of with like cranial nerve number 11 gets done from these top cervical spinal nerves. So do you kind of understand what this tells you about spinal cord injuries? And how if they're higher, you're going to lose more functionality, right? If I had a really low lumbar spinal nerve injury, like between T12 and L1, I'm in all likelihood going to be able to regain at least a little bit of sensory or motor function in the top portions of my thighs, right? And my arms will be completely unaffected, but I'm going to lose more functionality lower. However, if you keep damaging further up, you're going to lose more functionality further up. If you are, for instance, like Christopher Reeve, that's probably an old reference because you guys might not know who he is anymore. Do you know who he is? Yeah, he is Superman. So he had a spinal cord injury, I think from horseback riding, right? Horseback riding. And I think his was C4, C5, if I remember correctly, right here. So he had lost complete functionality of his lower limbs and only had a teeny tiny little bit of functionality in his upper limbs, right? And was paralyzed really here on his thorax. Does that make sense? Because it was so high. If you get above C3, you're going to lose innervation to your diaphragm, and that's really, really almost impossible to survive from. C3, 4, 5 keeps you alive. That's the diaphragm innervation, but we'll learn that as we go through the plexuses. So this is just a little bit of an overview of the plexuses and the nerves that you're going to learn. So this week in lab, here's what you guys are going to do related to this, since I'm not going to get to it before you guys get to lab, most of you. You are going to learn basically what a spinal nerve is, right? You're not going to learn all of the complexities as it comes out, but you will learn the plexuses. And they're not hard because there's a cervical wad right here. There's a brachial wad right here. The thoracic ones don't form a plexus. They just kind of run parallel to one another. Then you've got a lumbar plexus and a sacral plexus. And here's what you're going to do next. You are going to learn nerves out of each plexus that innervate muscles that you already learned. Yes? Okay. So will you learn every single muscle that a nerve innervates? No, it has to be a muscle that was off the list that you already learned, right? So again, we're trying to make this one class, not 17 different classes. So for instance, you probably will not be at all surprised that a nerve called the radial nerve innervates a whole bunch of the muscles on the lateral portion right here. It's not going to be shocking to you. You will also figure out that the radial nerve has some sensory functionality over there. right? So that's what you guys are going to do. You're going to go put the muscles back together with the nerves that you're learning. And although it may sound overwhelming, that column, the innervation, used to be part of the muscle lab. And that was enough, wasn't it? The muscle lab was enough, right? So we moved it out, and now you just have to go back and revisit the muscles that you already learned. About 5 years ago, I moved it out. I was like, we could just move this into the nervous system lab. Okay, so that's what you guys are going to do. You're not going to learn every nerve at all, right? You just learn a few really important nerves that innervate really important regions or muscles. Okay, now let's just look at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. Okay, gross anatomy of the spinal cord, again, 16 to 18 inches long. It's not really easy to see in this picture, but it's pretty easy to see in the specimens. This region right here, the cervical region of the spinal cord, is usually slightly wider. And then it gets narrow in the thoracic region, and then it gets wide again in the lumbar region. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to why the cervical region tends to be wide and the lumbar region tends to be wide? Any idea? It's not pressure. It's got to do with what it's doing.
Probably thicker so it doesn't burst with flexion.
Nope. It's got to do with what it's innervating. What does the cervical region innervate? Keep going. Arms. Yeah? It's a whole bunch of fibers coming and going, right, to innervate the arms, yes? And then not a whole hell of a lot going on in here, especially if you know, which you will later, that most of the innervation of the inside of the thoracic and abdominal cavity does not come from those nerves. It actually comes from the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10. So it doesn't really have a whole hell of a lot to do in the middle, right? And then why is the lumbar region? Legs, yeah, right? Just got a whole bunch of fibers coming and going from the legs, whole bunch of fibers. Does that make sense? Now, I realize that it's not demonstrably larger in this picture, but it is actually noticeable in an actual specimen. You can see a little chubby portion of the cervical, and then it gets narrow, and then it gets chubby again at the end. So that's the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. Okay, now the spinal cord proper ends at a cone, and it's called the conus medullaris. So watch here so I can show it to you, okay? Ready? This is an actual specimen. So I have to kind of draw it for you. Ready? Oh, actually, I can draw it. Can I? No, it's not letting me. Okay. So let's see. So if I draw it for you, that is the chubby portion called the conus medullaris. It's a cone. Does that make sense? So the conus medullaris is the cone-shaped end of the spinal cord proper. And it just means cone in the middle. That's what conus medullaris means, is cone in the middle. Everybody okay with that? Okay. And the tip of the cone ends about L1 or L2. That's when the spinal cord proper ends. Please note that the conus medullaris is completely surrounded by nerves, but it's not CNS, it's PNS, right? And also that the nerves continue after the spinal cord has ended, okay? So the conus medullaris is that cone-shaped end of the spinal cord proper. And extending off the end of the conus medullaris is this one little string. Do you see that right there? It's like got a slightly different shade and texture from the ones around it. And in this figure, it's represented in green. Do you see the green one going all the way down? That is called the Filum Terminale. And what the Filum Terminale is it's not nervous tissue. It's connective tissue covered by pia mater. Here's what it does. It holds onto the end of the spinal cord. It straps it all the way down and attaches it to the sacrum to hold it in position. Yeah? So the pia mater continues, right, even after the spinal cord ends. And it attaches it all the way down. And you can see it right there, right? That it's attaching it all the way down to the sacrum. Good? Okay, so it attaches it all the way down to the sacrum. So Filum Terminale means last hair. Last hair. Okay, and then one last thing here, and that is all of these PNS nerves that extend around and past the spinal cord proper, this collection of nerves is called the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. Right? So although the words are all difficult, they mean something. So let's do this one more time. What is the cone-shaped end of the spinal cord? Conus medullaris. What is the hair that extends from the conus medullaris and straps it down? Filum terminale, which means last hair. And what are all the nerves that surround and then extend past the end of the spinal cord proper? Cauda equina. Does that make sense? Okay. So hard words, but they mean some things, or they're not quite as hard to remember as you would think. Okay. So now, just with our last few minutes, let's just introduce you to the concept of the spinal cord and cross section, and then I'll let you guys go. Okay. So when you're doing spinal cord structures in cross section, really your only challenge is to make sure you know anterior from posterior, because all of the structures within the spinal cord are all named anterior this, posterior this, and lateral this, or sometimes ventral this, dorsal this, and lateral this, okay? Which means that if you can't orient it, you're going to get all the structures wrong. And if you can orient it, it's super easy, right? Okay, so how do you orient the spinal cord in cross section? Well, if you have a vertebra around it, you sure as hell better be able to do it, right? Because if you don't know that the spinous process is posterior by this point, you should probably be failing lab, right? Because you got one, like you can literally feel it, like you got a cheat sheet back there. So of course this is posterior and this is anterior, right? But you don't always have this, the vertebra around it. So how do you do it if you don't have the vertebra around it? So a whole bunch of different ways to do it. I'll tell you that the way that is dependable for me. Oh, hold on. The way that is dependable for me is to use two different things, okay? First off, if you look at the spinal cord in cross section, you'll see that it's white matter on the outside and gray matter on the inside, right? But the gray matter has a characteristic shape. The shape changes a little bit as you move from cervical to thoracic to lumbar, but this thing that I'm going to tell you about the shape is consistent all the way through, okay? Now, do you see that the shape right here looks kind of like, do you know what a swallowtail butterfly is? Round wings on the top and pointy wings on the bottom? Yeah? Kind of looks like a swallowtail butterfly to me. The pointy wings are always pointing toward the back, so the butterfly is flying with you, that direction, right? And they always almost touch the edge of the spinal cord. Does that make sense? Okay. So if you know that, then the round wings are always anterior and the pointy wings are always posterior. And it doesn't matter where you're looking. It's very consistent, right? And the round wings, do you see they don't come anywhere near the edge of the spinal cord? So that's easy to remember as well. Can you guys all see that, the butterfly in there? So that is very dependable to me. And it works all different levels. And then there's one other thing that's dependable. And that is that once you guys get into this week, you will see that these guys right here are called roots. Okay. One of the roots always has a ganglion on it and the other one doesn't. Okay. The one that has a ganglion on it is called the dorsal root, and it's called the dorsal root ganglion, right? So that confirms what you already said. This is dorsal or posterior, yeah? Okay. And the other one never does. So dorsal root ganglion. So let's just look at another one. Can you tell anterior from posterior in this picture, even if it wasn't written, with the two tools that you have? Your butterfly flying toward the anterior, right? And then you've got a ganglion on the dorsal or the posterior one, right? So as long as you can do that, you'll be able to figure out the regions of the gray matter and the regions of the white matter. So just with our last couple of minutes, I'll go ahead and introduce you to these, and then we'll start here on Thursday as well. So here's the deal with gray matter, white matter, and we'll start talking about functionality in just a minute. So depending on where you're looking in the spinal cord, you have different gray matter horns. They call the chunks of gray matter in the spinal cord. They don't call them nuclei for whatever reason. They call them horns. And it's like you have an anterior horn, that's the top of the butterfly wing, right? You got a posterior horn, that's the back, and then sometimes you have a lateral one, right? In the cervical region, you don't have a lateral horn, so don't be surprised if you don't see them all the time, right? So you got an anterior horn. I call them gray horns. That's how I learned them. Anterior gray horn, posterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, right? You don't have to put gray in there, but I'm in the habit of doing it, so you'll hear me do it, okay? So as long as you have the orientation right, you really can't miss those, right? And then these guys right here, the white matter portions. Oh, right, one last thing. You also have a gray commissure. Even though commissural tracts are generally white matter, this commissure, the gray commissure, connects the left and the right. So it's called the gray commissure, and it has the central canal in the middle of it. Good? Okay, and then these guys, the white matter, they're primarily just big collections of projection tracts, right? Okay? You don't have to know the individual projection tracts. They all do different things depending on where they are in the spinal cord. But they are called one of two things. They're either called white columns, which would make sense, right? Because it's a column. Yes? Okay. Or they're called funiculi. Anybody but me ever ride a funiculus in Europe? No? They have them in other, you know what a funiculus is? And where? Oh, yeah. These funiculi are, the reason it's called a funiculus, and I literally just learned this yesterday, like literally yesterday. Funiculi, if you want to ride something, it's kind of like a ski lift, but it's like a little car that you would ride up to the top of a mountain. They call it a funiculus, right? So it goes up and back and up and back. That's why these are called funiculi, because they actually carry information top to bottom, top to bottom. And I literally never understood that until yesterday, and then somebody pointed it out to me, and I'm like, oh, that makes sense. But if you don't know funiculus, it doesn't help you. So what do you have to use? You can use white column if you want to. That's fine. Okay. Funiculus is, this is actually the only textbook that I know that uses funiculus. Most of the time they call them white column. So one more time. So here's what we have. We have anterior white column, right? Posterior white columns, lateral white columns, and then we have a little portion that's in the middle that's called the white commissure. Right? And as long as you know anterior from posterior, then all of that's super easy. Yeah? Okay. All right. We will stop there for today. I will see you guys on Thursday, and we will do this set of notes on Thursday.